What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be diving into the 10 starter decks that we got in Arena over the summer. Now that rotation has happened, we are a little bit more even when it comes to what cards these decks contain and what cards would be available in Arena. The only thing that these decks don't contain are any of the cards from Dominaria, and I do think, just kind of off the cuff, when I kind of look and played these decks, that is kind of the one thing these decks were missing. I do think if you're going to upgrade these decks, looking to add cards from Dominaria could help them out a lot. Some of these decks, actually, because Dominaria is now a thing, I think some of these decks are now obsolete, especially in budget forms, as some of these decks do things that other cards have been introduced and I think are overall just better to make a deck around than some of the cards that are in these starter decks. But, you know, with that out of the way, I will say that I played 30 games of this. I played each deck three games in ranked mode. I won a total of 8 and 22, so I lost a lot more than I did win, but I did win some games, which is definitely pretty awesome. I wasn't expecting to win much, but I mean, almost winning a third of my games that I played is definitely not that bad. I am, not super high ranked in, the ranked ladder. I am only gold rank, I think 4 or 3 at this time. I'm not sure 100% where I left off, because I did go on a little bit of streak. The last deck I played, I did go 3-0, which is pretty interesting. I don't know if that's just one of those things because I lost so many games. I don't know if they were matchmaking me below, a certain area because of my games that I lost, and then they kind of try to match up and try to find people around the same, win-loss record, as that is supposedly a thing that happens in Arena. I wasn't throwing my accounts, so hopefully I don't get, in trouble for losing so many games. But with that out of the way, let's just dive into the list and kind of start talking about each deck. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support. So here is a tier list that I put together with 3 different categories. One is a category of worth upgrading. The other category is depends on the matchup, as the meta has kind of shifted to a more heavy mono black format, and some of these decks just aren't good in that sort of format, as well as there is the third tier, which is a don't upgrade. Even if they are your favorite, I just don't see these decks really being super viable, at least in the current standard, just because what they're trying to do just doesn't kind of work, especially with mono black being kind of the main deck, or decks that are playing black cards that are super effective. Some of these decks I just feel like don't fare very well, especially against that matchup, or they just are outdated, I would say, just because I do think there are better variations of maybe that deck that these cards are playing that you could play instead and probably have more success overall. So that's kind of where I lean with all these piles. And I will go through each deck, and I kind of will explain how I did overall with each deck record-wise and how I felt about the deck as I played them. So the first deck up on the list is going to be On the Hunt. Now, this is the Werewolf variation deck. This is a very budget, I would say, Werewolf deck, which is definitely not a bad thing. I do like Werewolves, especially in a more limited meta, when you're playing around just a couple mechanics and having the synergy of playing Werewolves. I do think that this deck is fairly good. I do think if you decide to go ahead and upgrade it, I do think it's actually worth upgrading. I am a big fan. I went 2-1. That's not bad, I would say, overall. I did get, I think, some favorable matchups. And this is one of the decks I played fairly early. I played them in the order that they are in the starter deck list, so that's kind of how I went through. So it's not that I played this at the end, played it at the beginning. This is the starter deck version of the deck. I didn't add or subtract anything, so this is all from that starter deck row. But I do think Werewolves, at least in the current meta, I think has a home. I think Rule Aggro in general could find a home. It's aggressive. It has ways to kind of overwhelm the battlefield, which is definitely not a bad thing to have, especially against like a mono black deck or decks like that. It can overwhelm some of the mid-range decks as well of the format. So I do think, On the Hunt is definitely a worthwhile deck to upgrade if that's something that you like. It's a fun aggro deck. Like I said, I like Werewolves, and it has good synergy, I think, overall with the cards that are even in the base starter deck. So it does feel pretty good to play. The next deck up is going to be the Blooming Growth deck. This one I went 1 and 2 with. This one I was not a big fan of. It felt clunky. It just didn't have what it needed to kind of be a deck that kind of fits well in the current meta. I think there are other variations of like a Simic ramp deck you could possibly play. I just don't think that in the current meta, this deck fits very well, especially with the certain configuration that the starter deck has. I just didn't feel like it had an aggressive enough way to put some presence on the battlefield in the early game to absorb some of that damage. And the top end of the deck it's definitely good, right? Like, this is a deck that contains Titan of Industry, which is a very strong card. I just don't know if it's a deck that, fits very well in the current meta, just because of the way that your opponent can play like things like Invoke Despair and things like that. Like I said, I did go 1 and 2, so it's not, the worst thing ever. I just don't think the Simic deck in this style really currently fits, but maybe down the road if you find some other cards, I think this is maybe one of those ones if you like the style of deck. This is more of a, you probably want to gut it and kind of almost rebuild it from the ground up. So that's why I don't think the starter deck itself is worth upgrading, but I do think the idea of maybe ramping into big things is a possibility. The next deck up on the list is Strength in Numbers. This is the one that plays a bunch of tokens and things like that. I actually found this deck to be really good. I ended up going. This is the last deck I played before I wrapped up playing the 30 games. I ended up going 3-0. So it's definitely not a bad deck. It is one of those things you kind of are susceptible to things like Meat Hook Massacre, like ways to wipe the battlefield will definitely take advantage of this deck. But you can definitely get some decent board presence as well as hand advantage just because it plays a couple cards that fills your hand up, which I found to be very helpful, especially in a mono black matchup, which I ended up pulling out and ended up winning, which is definitely pretty cool. But yet again, like I said, I'm at like gold rank, so it could mean a little bit. But yet again, there are a lot of things that could help overall token style decks. You play things like Wedding Invitation. There is the new King guy that gives all creatures you control +1/+1, and himself also gives himself +1/+1. I think makes a soldier token. This is definitely a deck that I think there are avenues to possibly upgrade this with. And I actually probably would put this in a worth upgrading kind of area, just because I do think maybe as the meta still shifts, as we're still kind of seeing how the overall meta is kind of adapting to the fact that mono black is the top deck. I do think that we'll see less mono black and maybe less Meat Hook Massacres, which then maybe puts a deck that plays a lot of tokens that can get very wide on your opponent, maybe into an area that depending on the matchup, I do think this can really win games. And like I said, if you can get a board presence fairly early, this definitely disrupts a lot of what mono black is trying to do, because mono black is trying to keep you very limited on your board state, and because this deck creates a bunch of tokens and fills your hand up with some of the cards that are actually in the starter deck version, it's definitely a deck that could be underestimated, especially by your opponent. And I do think, like I said, it could be worth upgrading. I'm not sure 100% on the path I would go, but I do think that a token style deck could be a thing just to kind of create a board presence and just overwhelm your opponent. The next deck up on the list is the Angelic Accountants. This is the Zorius Angel deck that is kind of like Angels / it's like some other cards that aren't Angels. This deck I did not do very well with. This deck I also didn't find to be very, very good. The synergies kind of didn't feel very put good together. There were cards that connive. There's cards that give certain effects if you have modified creatures. But there isn't like really any big payoff to paying like a ton of Angels per se in this deck. This is probably a deck that would benefit from cards from Dominaria, but I also probably wouldn't play the blue. Personally, I'm more of a fan of playing like the Orzhov colors or maybe the splash of red, like that mid-range deck I built the other day here on the channel. And I do think it's an okay pass pre-rotation before we got announced what was going to be in Dominaria United. I just don't think in the way the way the Angels have shifted, I just don't think playing blue and what this deck is trying to do is going to work in the current meta. And I probably would also put this in that don't upgrade kind of category, just because it just feels very clunky. To me, it doesn't feel very fun to play, and I'm not sure if any of you guys have played it, but I just personally just don't like the way the deck synergizes overall. The next deck up is going to be Balancing Act. This is the Orzhov style deck. This one was kind of unique. It was more so that I wasn't doing anything to really finish off my opponent. I was just more so annoying my opponent with what I was playing in the deck. It's trying to do like the whole synergy, I think, from Kamigawa, that if you have an artifact and an enchantment out, you get some sort of effect kind of thing. It's just not, it's okay, but it's not really that great. And I'm not really even sure where you would upgrade. Maybe this is something where you go into something maybe go into like Greasefang with, but overall, just the sheer presence of it just didn't feel really put together. It is kind of slow, especially, like I said, in the current meta. And in the games where maybe it was close, I was just more so annoying my opponent to, finish me off than really trying to push for the victory, just because the way the meta is. It creates some sort of board presence, and there are some decent cards in it. I just think that this deck just doesn't really fit very well with the current meta, so this is also probably another deck I'd put in the do not upgrade. I'd probably look other avenues if I was trying to play a deck of this caliber. And going 0-3 just doesn't make the deck overall feel very well. And there wasn't any games that was super close that I was going to be able to finish off my opponent. So that's why it falls into this category. The next deck up on the list is going to be Grave Matters. This is the Golgari kind of self-mill kind of deck that is, it's interesting, right? It's kind of one of those things that it's going to be dependent on matchup. This is actually the first deck, I think, out of all of them that's going to be dependent on matchup, just because you are putting things in your graveyard, and that leaves you open to people doing things with those cards that are now in your graveyard. Which, you know, for example, Graveyard Trespasser is a really big card, especially because Mono Black is kind of like one of the more played decks of the format. And I do think that that's kind of a matchup where this deck kind of struggles against anything that's going to, you know, take advantage and eat things in your graveyard or take things out of your graveyard and things like that. This is where this deck is going to struggle. But I do think that there is a place for it. We did get some interesting cards from Dominaria United. But like I said, it's probably going to be more on the way of matchup dependent more than anything, just because if they have a way to kind of interact with the graveyard, it's kind of like, unfortunately, just one of those things that this deck can't overcome. It has a little bit of removal. It does a little bit of things to kind of maybe get some of that stuff back, but it just doesn't do enough, at least in the shell, especially against a Mono Black, to really take advantage of. So definitely kind of in that thing that's dependent on matchups, and I do think this could get some upgrades. I just think it really depends on how you feel personally about it when it comes to upgrading the deck itself. The next deck up is going to be the Ignite the Forge, and this is kind of one of those decks that I kind of felt pretty good about initially when I first saw the list, that it could be playable even in its current form. Though I ended up going 0-3, which is not very good, but I also wasn't consistently drawing the right things I needed to really get the anvil really going. There was some games where I just didn't even draw the anvil, but I drew some of the other stuff from the deck. And I do think that's kind of one of those things with the anvil deck. If you really can't turn on the anvil very easily, it's where you're going to struggle, right? If you can't reproduce your 1/1 tokens and kind of drain your opponent a little bit here and there. This is also a deck that also is worth upgrading, just because I know anvil is a very prominent deck in the meta. It's just going to take a little bit of rares and mythics probably to get it to a place that is a little bit more playable, as I also think there's a lot of cards in this deck that, because we're trying to focus around sacrificing artifacts and producing artifacts, that this deck kind of lacks some of those things. There are some cards in here that are in the upgraded version of the deck, but I would say in its current version, it's going to take a little bit more grinding and a little bit more crafting to probably put it in a position that this version of the deck at least has some sort of chance to win. But yet again, it is a deck that's worth upgrading if you like, you know, the kind of, you know, drain and make creatures kind of thing. So definitely not a bad deck to look at. I just don't think the initial starter deck version of it is any good. Now, the next deck up on the list is going to be the Storm of Blades list, and this is the Samurai Warrior kind of deck. This deck was interesting, right? I ended up winning a game, so I went 1-2 with this deck. It's going to be also dependent on matchup, I feel like, just because like Mono Black has a lot of ways to neutralize your single creatures, and this is a deck that kind of maybe has a couple creatures out on the battlefield but doesn't have a ton of presence on the battlefield, and that's where the deck is going to struggle, any sort of matchup where it's going to be faced up against that. But I feel like if you get a consistency amount of samurais / warriors in the deck, this deck is still not that bad. You know, if your opponent doesn't have any sort of way to really remove any of that stuff, you can definitely put some pressure on your opponent pretty quickly. And, you know, in the one game that I ended up winning with this deck, I ended up doing that. You know, I got my opponent kind of low, and all I needed really to do was to top deck a creature that could get through for some points of damage, and my opponent didn't have anything to react to it. So I was able to win with this deck. So I would say this is a deck that is worth upgrading, but yet again, it's going to be dependent on matchup. It's not a very favorable in a deck that plays a Liliana in that sense, just because you're not going to create a very large board presence. That Liliana's -2 is going to be definitely very effective against this, but still, nonetheless, I do think it's a pretty fun deck. I also did a budget version of this deck, I think, before rotation happened on my channel, that you could check out if you want, but still, nonetheless, I do like the Samurai / Warrior style deck that is trying to take advantage of attacking with a single creature and getting some sort of effect. Now, the next deck up on the list is gonna be the Ninjutsu deck. It is the Stealthy Subterfuge deck. This is a deck that I do think can see some play, as you know, tempo decks have kind of started making their way up the ladder, as because of the more mid-rangey style decks. These tempo style decks are definitely very favorable against that matchup. And I do think with some modifications, this deck is definitely very favorable to be able to be playable in the current meta. I just don't think that, you know, people haven't really adapted Ninjutsu into that tempo style. I do think there are good cards in black and blue that will help this deck. Definitely various ways to protect your creatures in the deck, as well as being able to kind of target your attacks and kind of do some point of damage either to your opponent's face, get some sort of card advantage out of it, or even look at their hand and get some sort of, you know, maybe take a look at their hand, make them discard something. based on what these cards have, I do think Ninjutsu feels very well. I think people forgot about it, to be quite honest. And I do think if you're a tempo player, that the Ninjutsu style deck is definitely playable. And I do think with some minor tweaks and some upgrades, even not upgrading all the rares to like 4 of, adding some ways to kind of disrupt what your opponent's doing by countering spells and things like that, this deck is in a good place, especially if, you know, the meta goes very tempo based. I do think Ninjutsu is another tempo style deck that could fit very well in that meta. And the last deck up on the list is going to be the Spellweaver deck. This one I went 0-3 with, and I just didn't have a fun time playing it whatsoever. It's an Izzet style deck, so it's playing, you know, a basis of creatures and spells, and the deck is kind of one of those decks that is trying to pretty much play a spell to get some sort of trigger on a creature that pumps that creature and gets in for some damage. I think there's just so much better. There are so many better creatures that you could technically play, you know, that aren't in this deck that I feel like this deck should have had. There's no Delver. There's no of that new Thundering 2-drop that, you know, it's a 1/2 with trample. There's no, you know, any sort of cards that I feel like really help you out. A lot of the cards in the deck are kind of slow and clunky. I just personally wasn't a biggest fan of it, but yet again, this is a deck that if you decided to make, not with the basis of what's here, I do think it is definitely very playable. Though I just would say this deck is not one to upgrade. Like I said, I just don't think it's very good. Though I think the idea is there, I just think that it needs different cards to really make the idea anything of any sort of value. But with that out of the way, I mean, this is definitely kind of interesting. It was definitely kind of fun to play through the 30 games, even though some of the games I felt like just weren't as fun just because I was definitely very behind compared to my opponents. I still feel like these decks are, you know, definitely somewhere to start with. You know, not all of them are worth upgrading. It's definitely one of those things, as being someone who's been playing Magic for a while. Typically, starter decks aren't usually an area where decks are really relevant, though I would say that this time around they did add some decks that were somewhat relevant prior to rotation, and they could still technically be relevant post-rotation as well. Like I said, I do like the werewolves, I do like the anvil deck, I do like ninjas if, you know, tempo decks are going to become a thing. And, you know, the tokens deck actually is very surprising, though I do think there are some cards this deck could get, especially cards from Dominaria that could help out the tokens deck. And, you know, a couple decks here I think, you know, are very dependent on matchup. You know, the Samurais and the graveyard style deck is definitely something that is playable, though it's going to really depend on the matchups in general if they have some sort of way to really prevent you from building your battlefield. And then, you know, we have these 4 decks down here that, you know, either there's I get their decks, but they're not really anything that's going to be any sort of competitiveness. But like I said, some of them have decent ideas. It's just I just don't think they're playing the right cards to do set ideas. But with that out of the way, if you like this style of deck, or if you like this style of video, let me know in the comments below. Is there one that you've been playing? If you are someone who plays starter decks, let me know down below. Whether or not you maybe have a deck that maybe I didn't put in the right tier, let me know down in the comments below. If you like the video, hit that like button, definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to post new videos like this one here on the channel, hit that subscribe button. Until next time, I'll see you in the next video.